Here's some of the things it's important to know about David Lynch's Blue Velvet from 1986. Lynch, who was born in 1946, is widely regarded as the American director whose work most resembles European art films. Blue Velvet was probably the film that made him a major art film director, though he had done other things earlier, including Elephant Man, which has gotten a fair amount of attention from critics, and of course the first film adaptation of the science fiction novel Dune, which has been in the news recently a lot because of the remake of Dune. Lynch's Dune, which he himself has repudiated because he was never able to realize his vision there for budgetary and other reasons, is actually not as bad as its reputation, by the way. But it was really with Blue Velvet that he started to establish the distinctive style that we think of as Lynchian. Both Lost Highway from 1997 and Mulholland Drive from 2001 are also among the great American art films. And some of his other films, like Wild at Heart and Inland Empire, also certainly have their boosters. With all these films out there, though, it's probably the case that Lynch is still best known as the creator of the Twin Peaks television series, which ran for 2 seasons from 1990 to 1991. Again, a work in which Lynch was never able quite to realize his vision, largely due to network interference. But at the same time, it's still a legendary television series. Twin Peaks: The Return, which came on Showtime in 2017, though, did allow him to realize his vision for the series, and is widely regarded as one of the great works of 21st century American culture. Blue Velvet is a key example of postmodern film. Postmodernism is often seen as having a pop cultural component and a high cultural component, and Lynch's films tend to illustrate the high culture side of that equation, with somebody like Quentin Tarantino, for example, being the pop culture side. Though Lynch's films, though, almost always also contain strong pop cultural features as well. Lots of popular music in his films, and almost all of his films contain some sort of allusion to the Wizard of Oz. One of the things that Lynch is noted for is the kind of painting-like images that you see in his films, and this is certainly the case in Blue Velvet. Many of the images that we see, in addition, like white picket fences and birds and flowers, come with significant pre-existing associations because we've seen them so often in other contexts. At the same time, the context that we've seen them in are very different from the context of Blue Velvet, so there's a kind of cognitive dissonance created in the film between the beautiful, comforting images that we tend to think of as going with things like birds and flowers, and the troubling content of the film. It's also the case that these images in Blue Velvet are mediated or secondary. They're essentially images of images. The superficial tranquility of Lumberton is often quite transparently derived from nostalgic cliches of the American 1950s. So in creating this town, Lynch isn't representing a real town. He's representing images of a town that we've seen before in American culture. And in fact, the look of this town is more reminiscent of a Disney World town than of any real town that ever existed in the 1950s or any other time. And again, this film is set, I think, in the 1980s when it was made, but like many of Lynch's films, it has these kind of 1950s resonances to it. Meanwhile, the dark underside of Lumberton society that's so important in this film seems equally stereotypical, deriving its material and look from things like film noir, or at least what film noir might have looked like without the production code placing severe limitations on it. Again, you see here a picket fence with roses in a shot from the film, and a lot of the images in the film are of this type. They're sort of stereotypical images of small-town America. We also see images of the beauty of nature, like the bird shown here, but you'll also notice that the bird has an insect in its beak, reminding us that there's an awful lot of violence beneath all the beauty of nature. There's also some beautiful music in the movie, but beneath that there's also some violence and darkness. Angelo Badalamenti's score for the film is very crucial to its success, and Badalamenti has written the scores for pretty much all of Lynch's films. Blue Velvet also employs popular music that wasn't written by Badalamenti, especially the title song, of course, Blue Velvet. But the version of Blue Velvet delivered in the film by Dorothy Valens is dramatically different from the popular version recorded by Bobby Vinton in 1963. There's also a very important rendition of the Roy Orbison song In Dreams by a character named Ben, played by Dean Stockwell, that adds an extreme element of strangeness to the film. And in fact, the film is pervaded with images of strangeness. You'll hear repeated almost like a mantra throughout the film, "It's a strange world." And that, if you had to sum up the the point of this film in a way, that would be the one-line summary. You also see images of the innocence of school children, but again, there's always something a little bit darker beneath the surface. You'll see here the children at the school crossing, the one little black girl surrounded by all these white kids, which evokes, I think, the memories of the very, very difficult integration of schools in the South back in the 1960s. Here's a very famous painting of Norman Rockwell of a little girl named Ruby Bridges, who was the first black student to enter the New Orleans public schools in 1960. Had to be accompanied by U.S. Marshals who escorted her into and out of the school because of the threat of violence against her by the white population of New Orleans. So everything in this film is pervaded by a kind of doubleness, where there's a kind of bright side and a kind of dark side, and life in Lumberton is pervaded by this sort of doubleness, where you get a nice, beautiful, placid surface and then a dark world underneath. This is mirrored in Jeffrey, the main character's double love life with the female characters, Sandy and Dorothy. Sandy is sort of innocent and pure, and Dorothy has this kind of dark side to her and this dark life that she's living through. And so when Jeffrey becomes involved with her, he enters a whole different world. These two women thus form an ironic good girl, bad girl pairing of a type that's so often found in film noir, a genre that provided many important models for so many things in this film. Of course, the casting of Isabella Rossellini as Dorothy also evokes the golden age of Hollywood, because Rossellini is the daughter of Ingrid Bergman, one of the great stars of the golden age of Hollywood. And here we see Laura Dern and Kyle MacLachlan, who play sort of the young, innocent characters. And at this time, these two actors were very young and largely unknown as well, but they would go on and do lots of other things, including with Lynch. Laura Dern would star in Wild at Heart in 1990, and MacLachlan would star in Twin Peaks, also premiering in 1990. For some people, the highlight of this film, though, in terms of acting performances, is probably the performance of Dennis Hopper as Frank Booth, who epitomizes the dark underworld of Lumberton. And it's a completely unhinged, over-the-top performance that could have just become ridiculous, but it's so effectively done that it's really quite frightening. One of the things that we find in a lot of Lynch films, including Blue Velvet, is that the kind of eras in time that you would associate the various parts of the film with tend to slide around a little bit. So at one point you'll see something that seems to come from the 50s, then you'll see something that maybe came from the 60s, maybe something that came from the 80s. All of these decades are key objects of representation in the film. However, the coding of these different decades is a little unclear and open to interpretation. Frederick Jameson, for example, a very prominent cultural critic, argues that the film privileges the Reaganite 1980s over the countercultural 1960s. So he associates sort of the light, innocent side of Lumberton with the Reaganite 80s, and the dark side and Frank Booth with the countercultural 1960s. But you could also actually argue that it's exactly the opposite of that. And I think that's probably intentional. I think Lynch wanted us to be able to see this film in different ways. One of the reasons why I think you want to be careful about associating the 1960s counterculture with the dark and unsavory aspects of life in Lumberton is that the film does seem to tie into some of the key images that we associate with the countercultural perspective on the 1960s. I've already talked about the clear reference to Ruby Bridges when the students cross the road in that early shot in the film. There's also a very subtle late reference to the Vietnam War. And of course, civil rights, as associated with Ruby Bridges and the Vietnam War, were the two biggest issues in the 1960s counterculture, the two biggest political issues. And the film seems, with these kinds of images, to want to align itself with the counterculture in that sense. But it's done very subtly, and you're not sure how much to make of it. For example, the only real reference to the Vietnam War occurs in the scene late in the film when Dorothy appears at Jeffrey's house naked. You can see her here in the background in this kind of distinctive, kind of artificial looking pose. But I mean, she's in shock, and she's been through this horrible experience with Frank Booth. Isabella Rossellini has said that Lynch advised her to study a particular famous picture from the Vietnam War in acting this performance. And so here, and this is the photo that he was talking about. It's a very famous Vietnam War photo where we see this little girl here who's fleeing the burning of her village in Vietnam by American soldiers. So it's a very famous kind of anti-war image that associates Frank Booth maybe with the 60s, but not with the 60s counterculture, instead with the 60s military and authority. The 1950s do seem to be an object of nostalgia in the film, which they commonly are in Lynch's films. But again, there's always that kind of uncertainty in these kind of art films. Is this real nostalgia, or is it a pastiche of nostalgia? Again, with all these secondary images, you see lots of pastiche in this film. And it being a postmodern film, of course, you would expect to see that. And again, now, at the time it wasn't, but now it's ironic to have this 1950s nostalgia in a film from the 1980s, because we've seen so many images in our own culture recently in which the 1980s become an object of nostalgia. So there's a lot of interesting meanings in this film, some of which have actually only been acquired over time since the film was actually released. So they're not. But I think that's the way art films often work, is that they require so much interpretation and so much input, if you will, from the audience, that they can gain new meanings that the filmmakers weren't even aware of when they were making the film.